So it is my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I am your host for tonight, Mary Jane Calderon. I am coming to you live from my office in Behringer-Crawford Museum. We have a great presentation for you tonight, or today, this afternoon, I should say. Before we get started, let's thank those that make this program possible. Northern Kentucky History Hour is a project of Behringer-Crawford Museum, Northern Kentucky's History Museum. Behringer-Crawford Museum is supported in part by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Kentucky Humanities, the Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph E. Hale Jr. Foundation, and our members. If you are not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. Let's go ahead and meet this afternoon's speaker. Born and raised in Campbell County, Kentucky, Russ Thomas has always had a passion for history, serving on the board of directors of the Campbell County Historical and Genealogical Society and researching General James Taylor while working at the Taylor Mansion. He has been married for nearly 40 years to his wife, Sandy, and has 5 sons, 8 grandchildren, and 1 on the way. That's excellent. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Russ, are you ready?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Let's go ahead and share your screen and get started.
Oops. And as usual, I fat thumbed the button.
It's all right.
Share screen. There we go. Okay. This evening we're going to talk about General James Taylor and his interactions with people of color. General James Taylor is a fairly well-known individual in Northern Kentucky, Campbell County in particular. We all know or should know the basic facts. Born in Virginia in 1769, he moved to the city of Newport, which he and his father founded in 1792. Married to David Leitch's widow, Keturah Moss Leitch, in 1795. Father to 11 children, 7 of whom died before becoming adults. In addition to founding Newport, he was a banker, an industrialist, and a land speculator. As quartermaster general in the War of 1812, he was responsible for moving an army from Newport Barracks to Detroit, Michigan, and then back to Newport after the surrender to the British by General Hall. These are the highlights, the simple points that do little to capture the whole man. He was, as we say today, complicated. General Taylor wrote about his life between about 1776 and about 1820 in a handwritten account. These memoirs are another facet of the man, and the reason I often call him the Forrest Gump of the 1800s. In his day, the general was not just a local hero. He played on the national stage and in national politics. In his memoirs, he recounts many of his brushes with greatness. His father, Colonel James Taylor, was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and took his son with him one day so he could hear Patrick Henry speak. His speech included the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." He also recounts a week he spent at Mount Vernon, staying with George Washington's nephew and being accorded the rare privilege of entrance into the crypt with the remains of George and Martha. Later, he spent a week in Braintree, Massachusetts with John Adams, receiving a tour of the Bunker Hill battlefield from the general who led the American forces that day. Thomas Jefferson was a constant pen pal. They often exchanged letters and plant cuttings. Taylor was also collecting salt at Big Bone Lick, found some interesting bones and forwarded them to Jefferson, igniting Jefferson's interest in paleontology. James Madison was his second cousin, as his grandfather, James Madison, and Madison's grandmother, Frances Taylor, were siblings. Zachary Taylor was another second cousin. His grandfather, Zachary, was another sibling of James and Frances. General John Tolliver Thompson was a nephew, with a few greats and grands thrown in, as was Brent Spence. Thompson was the inventor of the Tommy gun. Spence was a longtime congressman for the Newport district. Another cousin, many times removed, was Helen Marie Taylor, Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations. As an aside, when discussing family, General Taylor is known in the genealogies as James V, as he was the 5th James out of a total of 10, none of whom had a middle initial. James I was born in 1610 in England. James X died in 2010, a total of 400 years and 10 generations of lineage. There was no James the 11th. General Taylor was a slaveholder. While today we see slavery, as we should, as barbaric and inhumane, 200 years ago the practice was legal and in some circles moral. It was and is considered by economists as a way of controlling the cost of labor by using capital. So we must examine a person in their time, not in ours. With that in mind, Taylor's association with both his slaves and other persons of color becomes challenging to decipher. One of the early stories in the general's memoirs recounts a conversation he had with one of the two slaves he brought west with him, Moses. Moses was trying to persuade his master to move to Lexington or back to Virginia, as he and Humphrey were the only black men in town with no women to do their washing or for companionship. The general goes into great detail about why the Newport side is superior to the worn-out land of Virginia, and that he owned no land in the Lexington area to move to. He also explained that there would be many companions for them in the near future. He asked Moses to be patient. The next paragraph describes how he found these two men had deserted Newport with all their clothing and headed to Lexington, to James's brother Hubbard's plantation. Taylor was easily able to track them, as they were the only people in Newport other than him who wore shoes. All others wore moccasins. In the details, it is the details in these reports I find interesting. The fact that these two men were outfitted with multiple sets of clothes and shoes, when the rest of the neighborhood wore moccasins and homespun or leather, is interesting. As is the reported conversation between James and Moses. James was trying to convince his slave to stay in Newport, and these slaves felt secure enough in their relationship with their master to raise these issues. Also note that these men did not run away as much as they returned to a place they felt comfortable. Obviously, we just have the account of this relationship written by the general some 35 years later, and it may be a self-serving story, but it does fit with the other relationships General Taylor had with African Americans. Later in his memoirs, he recounts a smallpox epidemic in Cincinnati in 1793, and how he had himself and his three slaves, Moses, Humphrey, and Adam, vaccinated against the disease. Humphrey contracted the disease and lingered through the fall of 1796, dying after 3 years of suffering from an incapacitating illness. He also mentions at this time, in 1793, he was gifted a family of slaves, an 80-year-old man and his wife and their 4 children. He also notes that they contracted smallpox, quote, in the natural way, end quote, and survived. At this point, Taylor already had a female servant, something mentioned only this once, and he convinced his cousin to hire the wife. First, let's look at the smallpox vaccination. While having his property protected in a proven method from illness would be prudent, other actions may indicate that it was done also as the act of an employer. His treatment of Humphrey is a clue. Humphrey was not able to care for himself for 3 years. James had several courses open to him. He could have simply abandoned him to face probable death, or he could have tried a sale, or simply granted Humphrey his freedom, again leading to his possible death. But he did the proper thing. He cared for him through his lingering illness until his death. The second case is the case of Jack and his wife. General Taylor's memoirs has a description of Jack and his abilities, calling him, quote, a stout old man who took care of my small stock, end quote. And it is these abilities and his age that convinced the general to release him so that he could be with his wife and children, as she was leaving with Thompson Taylor, a cousin of James Taylor's. Earlier, he notes that he had been gifted his family of slaves, yet he says he convinced his cousin to hire the wife. He doesn't mention giving her or her children their freedom, yet he also does not use the words buy or sell. It is possible that he rented her to his cousin, but no further mention is made of her or her family. He owned many slaves, but in his will, he granted them manumission, a release from slavery, once the men reached the age of 30, or in the case of women, 28.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. Thanks, Glenn. Talk to you. Bye-bye.
Save one, Thomas Fields, sometimes called Thomas Curry, who had caused the fire at his mansion, Bellevue, in 1842. He was required to serve the family until he was 40 years of age, and then he was freed with the condition he leave Kentucky forever. 3 of these slaves were granted an easy retirement and the use of land, but not granted the land itself. Section 35, the clause that deals with the bequest to his slaves of General Taylor's will, runs almost 4 handwritten pages. First is the grant to his faithful servant Mingo. He is given lifetime use of 5 acres from the Banklick tract, materials to build a house, a cow, mare, or horse worth $25, a sow and pigs, as well as 50 bushels of corn, a barrel of flour, and 300 pounds of pork. Another specific request is to James Smith and Millie, his wife. They were again granted the use of 5 acres for their lifetime, along with the same bequest as Mingo was given, as to a cabin, livestock, and provisions. This grant of acreage was from the Bellevue tract, the tract where the Bellevue Mansion is located. The will does not detail how these bequests were to be made, such as was the 300 pounds of pork to be in a single delivery, or was it to be in small withdrawals from Bellevue stores. Either way, the bequest was designed to provide a comfortable retirement for these individuals. Unfortunately, there is no record of whether or not these bequests were carried out by James VI. But as these individuals were probably held in high esteem in the family, the bequests were most likely carried out as the general requested, and they would have cost very little. The others were granted land in the Clark tract, southwest of Alexandria, just west of Claryville, and the Miller and Maddox Road areas. For those not familiar, Claryville is the site of Campbell County High School. Each male was to receive 25 acres, provided they served the family until the age of 30. The female slaves were each to receive $25 in their freedom, provided they served the family until the age of 28. Unfortunately, these people did not receive their land or animals. The why is complicated. General Taylor's son and executor, James Taylor VI, did not initially honor the conditions of the will. News reports of the day seem to say that the family immediately released all of the slaves in 1848, refusing them to be of service until the age of 30, negating that clause of the will for some individuals. These folks had no way of enforcing the bequest either. As slaves, they had no standing to sue in any court, as was the result of the 1857 suit brought by Colonel Taylor as executor of the estate, asking the court to determine which tract of ground the acreage should be subject to these divisions. This action was probably still in the probate of the general's will, but as none of the articles mention the case name, which has made the case difficult to find. According to the Kentucky State Journal on June 9th, 1891, quote, the Campbell County Circuit Court, that it had been decided therein that these parties were not entitled to this land or any part of it, although the record in the case referred to plainly showed that these plaintiffs were not and could not have been in contemplation of law parties to that suit, and that no such issue was involved in the case, and the matter relative to this land that plaintiffs were seeking to recover not in any way comprehended or passed upon in the judgment, end quote. Basically what they're saying is that because they don't have the right to sue, they don't have the right to gain standing to win their property. After the Civil War, they had gained some standing to file suit, but did not do so until 1883. Winning their suit locally in 1889, an appeal went their way as well in 1891, some 43 years after the general's death and 8 years after Colonel James Taylor's death. The fact that Colonel Taylor did not do as his father's will requested is fascinating. The question is why? If we assume his father had a kindly attitude toward his slaves, as the conditions of the will would indicate, why did his son not have the same attitude? Why did he rely on a court decision to not make the proper bequests and did not simply fail to activate the property transfer? Why did the court make such a decision counter to the stated clause of the will? Several things are probably in play. 40 former slaves, each with adjoining property of 25 acres, would be a 750-acre parcel, and it would have created a large community of free Black men and women. By determining that they had no standing to own the land, the court ended that possibility. I am assuming that Colonel Taylor asked the court to determine the location of the bequest because of public opinion. No one wanted this community in their neighborhood, a fact of life in the 1850s. This order probably reflected public opinion and did remove the possibility of action from James VI. Creating this community would have probably created ill will against the Taylor family, something James V most likely would not have concerned himself with. Manumission at the owner's death was not unknown, but it also was not common. Several of the southern states had laws against the practice. In some of the cases I have seen, when the slaves were released, they were requested to emigrate to Liberia. While most of you are probably familiar with Liberia, I always believe that giving information twice is better than not giving it at all. Liberia was founded in 1822 as a place for sending freed Black American slaves. Between 1822 and 1861, more than 15,000 freed and freeborn Blacks emigrated to Liberia. It was President Lincoln's plan for the Blacks freed by the Emancipation Proclamation to send them to Liberia. Another provision of the general's will concerning his slaves was to provide spots for them in Evergreen Cemetery, near his own gravesite. Two were buried near him in marked graves. One, according to the Evergreen burial records, is James Smith, Uncle Jimmy on his stone. The stone also notes that he is 101 years old. This is most likely the James Smith who was granted a specific bequest as to the property and livestock in the general's will. The other is simply noted as Chloe. These graves are on Taylor Hill and Evergreen, intermingled with the family graves, and within yards of both the general and James VI. What was the reason behind this clause? Did other slaves also take advantage of this bequest, but their burials are unmarked and unrecorded? The will gives no stated purpose behind this bequest, so we are left to speculate as possible reasons. Most slave-owning families had a slave section in the family cemetery, such as the final resting place of Daniel Goff on the Alexander Marshall farm. So this may have been a written expression of that concept. Or was it because James felt a responsibility to make sure these people were cared for in life and in death? Based on other requests, that does seem possible. But was that due to a general attitude of caring, or was it a tenet of the noblesse oblige, defined as privilege entails to responsibility, a long-established principle? A case can be made for either reason. As a generations-old member of both the landed gentry and the peerage, James Taylor is a direct descendant of William the Conqueror. The concept of privilege entailing responsibility was most likely deeply ingrained. But the next case we look at, that of Daniel Goff, does not give us evidence for a general attitude of simply caring. Daniel Goff was born a free person of color in Virginia and was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, having served with Washington at Valley Forge, among other places. Goff came to Campbell County with Major David Leitch in the 1780s and came into General Taylor's employ when he married Keturah's widow, Keturah. Taylor employed him in many capacities, including as a long-term gardener on the general's estate. In 1833, years after he had left the general's employ and moved to what is today Florence in Boone County, he encouraged the elderly Daniel to apply for a soldier's pension for his service in the Revolution, and personally wrote an affidavit on Daniel's behalf. The pension was awarded, and Mr. Goff collected it until his death in 1843 at the age of 89. General Taylor also had enough respect for Goff to extend him credit at his store, as evidenced from his ledger from the early 1800s. One interesting fact in the affidavit is the general's statement that he had had several conversations over Goff's 20 years of service with him concerning his service in the Revolution. In Daniel's pension application, General Taylor's affidavit is quoted as saying, General Taylor, quote, had numerous conversations with said Goff in relation to his services, that his account of his services in the Revolution has been uniformly the same, and from this affianced knowledge from history and the character of many of the officers he, Goff, served with, and a personal knowledge of some of them confidently believes that he served as he has sworn and stated in his declaration, end quote. What is interesting here is the report of numerous conversation, as in the original, with Daniel. Here's another reported instance of a long-term acquaintanceship, probably bordering on friendship, with a person whom, in other circumstances, he could have considered property. These conversations, while detailed here only as concerning his service to the country, must have been far-ranging in the over 2 decades Daniel was in the general's employ, and the additional 20 years or more that they were acquainted. Today, we look at the attitude of owning black slaves as a bar toward any association with other individuals of that same color, or even of the individuals that were property. But apparently, it was not for General Taylor. Was the general's attitude singular or widespread? There are multiple articles available, as well as a historic novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that detail horrific treatment of slaves. The sale of children or husbands away from families, torturous punishments, rapes, and sexual abuse. The reports of mistreatment abound. There are no reports of similar treatment for the slaves under Taylor's ownership, but an absence of proof isn't proof of the absence of ill treatment. The general's memoirs do not mention any punishments meted out to uncooperative slaves. If there are any punishments for Moses or Humphrey after their departure and recapture, it's not detailed in his memoirs. The sole punishment we have of evidence was for Thomas Curry, the slave who burned Bellevue in 1842. The Licking Valley Register noted on March 19th of 1842, in reporting on the fire, that it was supposed to be the work of an incendiary. His punishment was to serve the family to the age of 40, as compared to the age of 30 for the other male slaves, and then either leave Kentucky or remain enslaved. Some southern states would have allowed for the killing of Thomas Curry for his crime, and a severe beating is a distinct possibility. But it is possible that the fire was accidental. All-consuming blazes in the days when fire was a constant servant for heating, cooking, and light were all too common, and it is possible that the fire was not intentional. But if it was accidental, then why any punishment at all? Just another historical occurrence that we have more questions than answers for. This brings us to the story of the Bellevue Mansion. There is no doubt that the original Taylor cabin in Newport was built with slave labor. Moses and Humphrey may have had some help from other slaves, or even James himself. His memoirs do mention that he did do physical labor to clear and plant the first year's corn crop. The multiple additions and modifications to the original structure were also done with a majority of the labor being slave. The current home, most likely built circa 1820, was also built with slave labor. The bricks were made by hand from a brickyard General Taylor owned. Cherry and poplar came from the Bellevue tract. The dressed stone was purchased from Ohio and the lead from Missouri. All of these materials were assembled with skill by the slave labor owned by General Taylor. Most of this work was lost in the 1842 fire. The rebuilding of Bellevue between 1842 and circa 1846, the 1846 date is based again in the General Taylor's will. His will was written that year, and in it he grants Keturah the use of 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down in the mansion if it's finished in her lifetime. Was again undoubtedly done by slave labor. Again, the wood came from Taylor land, sawn and milled in Taylor mills, and most likely assembled in fantastic fashion by Taylor slaves. The semicircular staircase is a beautiful creation in cherry and mahogany, and is very similar to the staircase that once graced the general's granddaughter's home, built in 1852, the castle. Later known as Mount St. Martin's, it's now demolished. Both of these staircases were most likely created by the same very talented woodworker and a slave. The plaster work on the ceilings in the public rooms in Bellevue is a masterwork of creation. Done in a Greek revival style, they were most likely created by following a pattern book, a 2-dimensional drawing that relied on the skill of the artisan to produce in a 3-dimensional shape. That skilled artisan was most likely a slave. We have no records of either the building or the rebuilding of the mansion, but it was a common practice in the days of slavery to either purchase the skilled craftsmen you required, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, or other artisans, or rent them from a neighbor for the period you required their skills, provided you didn't already own someone with the skill set you required. Hiring a skilled craftsman was also an option, and in some cases, these craftsmen were free men of color. So we have a better than 50% chance that the work was done by slave labor. Does this tell us anything about General Taylor's relationship with African Americans? Possibly. Assuming the workforce of skilled craftsmen was at least 50% slave labor, and quite possibly as high as 75% or more, there had to be a huge trust factor in the skills of these men. There also had to be a significant amount of communication between Taylor and these craftsmen. While this is a supposition, we do have his documented relationships with Moses and Daniel Goff, as detailed earlier, that shows a significant amount of consistent friendly interaction with individuals that would have been below his social class. It would be consistent for him to have had friendly relations with the craftsmen working on his home. One last topic to cover, the enduring story about Bellevue being a stop on the Underground Railroad and the tunnel. There are two well-documented routes in northern Kentucky for the Underground Railroad. The first ran east of Maysville, then to Ripley, Ohio. The other ran up the ridge in Boone County and then west to Indiana, basically following the route of I-75 to I-275 to Lawrenceburg. That does not mean escaping slaves did not go through Newport, but there were probably very few. The barrier is, of course, the Ohio River. A slave could not take a ferry without the express permission of his master. The other option was to be ferried across by an individual. Once across, the city of Cincinnati would be a barrier to an escape, an issue not faced in the Indiana or Maysville routes. As the primary tour guide when I was working in the mansion, I heard many stories, some from family lore, some from published stories, and some that were the stuff of legend. Among the stories was one that a lantern would be hung from the widow's walk atop the mansion to alert escaped slaves to the presence of slave hunters in Newport. But of course, the most common was the tunnel. According to lore, a tunnel ran from Bellevue to the Ohio River, and this tunnel was used to smuggle escaping slaves into Ohio and freedom. The entrance to this tunnel was known to be in various places. The most common was through a skirted table located in the basement of the mansion. Others were through a huge oak door with a large brass lock. Another was a boarded up wall, again in the basement. I was told once that there was a second basement under the known basement, and that's where the entrance was. Yet another was through the garage on the property. There are several things wrong with these stories. The oak door was on a south wall, and it was the entrance to the Taylor wine cellar. The boarded up wall was at the end of the wing. It did face north, but the wall was primarily above grade, and the wing wasn't constructed until 1887. The floor in the basement was originally brick, and the brick were removed in the 1920s and concrete floors poured in most of the rooms. The sole exception was a room on the northeast corner. It still has its brick floor, but a false floor has been laid over it. No entrance to a lower basement was found. Many of these stories were told to us by adults who were given tours of the mansion in the 1950s as children. At ages when told something as a fact by an adult, they tend to accept the fact without skepticism. Jim Reese even included stories about the tunnel in his Pieces of the Past columns, detailing how it collapsed during the 1937 flood. Yet I have my doubts. The tunnel would have had to have been 500 feet long. Second, the mansion sits on a hill that drops off 20 feet in the first 30 feet toward the river. Third, in addition to be used for a secret purpose, it would have needed to have been built in secret. And lastly, no evidence that this tunnel has been found in any of the construction projects that have been done in the last 150 years between the mansion and the river. Additionally, once out of the tunnel, there was still the river to cross. Across from the mansion were the Fulton shipyards, where as early as 1819, 1/4 of the steamboats on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers were built. So that meant either drifting down the river to land west of Cincinnati and then rowing upstream back to home, or rowing upstream to Anderson Township to avoid landing in a populated area. Neither was a good option. There were also significant legal barriers to assisting slaves in escaping. During the general's lifetime, it was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that was being enforced, imposing a fine of $500 for aiding an escaped slave. Given the general's fortune, that fine probably would not have been a huge barrier, but as a slave owner, the stigma of being known as a escapee assister may have been. This is not to say that slaves may have been assisted in escaping by the general's family or slaves, possibly with his approval. Some of the stories I have heard involve a slave who had a ferry pass signed by Taylor that gave him permission to cross into Ohio and to have up to 2 slaves with him. Allegedly, this slave would use this pass to take escaped slaves into Ohio. Another story I'm trying to track down proof of is either James V or James VI, the stories vary, wrote a pass for a group of slaves to attend a religious meeting in northern Ohio. They then used this pass to escape into Canada. Once there, they wrote a letter back to Newport, letting their former master know that they had made it to Canada safely. This story claims that all the slaves were Taylor's. Some belonged to his business partner, Richard Southgate. I do not have proof of either of these stories. They may be true or they may be legend. If true, they may have happened with or without James Taylor's knowledge or assistance, which creates another question to explore. As a responsible slave owner, it's possible that he may have aided the escape of mistreated slaves. Again, we have absolutely no proof one way or the other. His memoirs are completely silent, other than the Moses and Humphrey incident, of any escapes or aids in escapes. These memoirs were written in the 1840s, when slavery was still legal and aiding an escape was not. Memoirs are seldom used to detail your undiscovered crimes. Based on the record we have, while limited, I think we can agree that James Taylor did own slaves and he treated them humanely. The history of his interactions with Moses, Humphrey, and Daniel Goff, to the bequests made in his will to all his slaves, leaves a trail that tends to leave a positive image of Taylor's treatment of people of color. Again, some of these stories are from his memoirs and could be self-serving. But I also had an in-depth conversation on this subject with Shirlene Jensen, who has done significant work on the Taylor slaves, particularly after the general's death. She told me that in her research, she found no record of General Taylor having ever sold a slave. But the Daniel Goff case is different. There is a public record of his positive interactions with him going back 40 years, both while he was in the general's employ as a free man and an additional 20 years after he had moved to Boone County. He then took the time to convince him to apply for the 3rd time for a pension he was owed and wrote an affidavit to support this application. Remember, James Taylor in 1834 was a national figure. His cousin, James Madison, was still alive, and in a few years, his cousin, Zachary Taylor, would become president. He was still in charge of the Newport barracks and would travel to Washington on a yearly basis to get reimbursed for the past year's expenses. His affidavit would have carried significant weight. Why would he place his reputation behind this elderly African American's application? Back in 2018, I was asked that specific question for a segment on Daniel Goff on the TV series Kentucky Life on KET. At the time, my response was that General Taylor was a big supporter of his country and its soldiers. I knew that he and Daniel Goff had had an acquaintanceship, but had not dived deeply into it. Today, I would answer that question differently after the research I've done for this presentation. For me, the evidence points to the idea that James Taylor did not, as a large percentage of Americans did at the time, consider African Americans subhuman. I believe he saw them as individuals and worthy of respect. How does that fit with the concept of ownership of these people? As I said earlier, ownership of slaves was a way of using capital to control the cost of labor. Yes, that ownership involved serious restrictions on the freedom of those enslaved. And in order to convince themselves that this was right and proper, they had to consider those enslaved as less than human. In none of the writings of James Taylor I've read, his memoirs, his will, and various letters available through the National Archives and private collections, does he address this issue in any respect or from any position. We have none of his words to explain how he felt about African Americans, but we do have his actions. Thanks for listening. Any questions?
Wonderful presentation, Russ. Thank you so much. Could you go ahead and end the share of your screen or stop the sharing, please?
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me still?
That's a little better, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead and stop the sharing of your screen.
Okay.
There we go. Wonderful. That was very interesting. I was just curious though, how you got involved in doing this research. How did you get started with this?
Well, of course, I've been studying Campbell County history since I was about 10 years old, which puts us back in the time when things were still on stone tablets. But you know, and when I worked at the Taylor Mansion, I got deeply involved in the mansion and by, you know, just adjacency, the family itself, you know, and you need to know, you know, about these people and where this home came from. And the outgrowth of that, you know, was, you know, the question that they asked me on Daniel Goff. And that led me to thinking, you know, what don't I know about these relationships? You know, and what kind of record do we have of those types of things? And that's what brought me into looking into it. And then, of course, you know, trying to draw conclusions from that. You know, and I think it's an interesting conundrum, you know, for someone to be both respectful of and owning other people. You know, but that's, you know, what I was looking into.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of research are you working on right now? Is there anything that...
Well, I've just finished this project. I do have a couple of other things in the works, you know, not related to James Taylor, but, you know, different things that have come up while I'm, you know, working here at the Historical Society. But, you know, I'm not going to, you know, go into what those are until they get more closer to a fruition.
I get it. Is there a place where people could go on the Historical Society's website or somewhere where they could go if they wanted to get more information about Taylor?
We are in the process of recreating a Taylor family website that we had that was owned by the Gerner and Kearns law firm, and when we were in the mansion, and trying to find some of that information, finding the pictures and things that they had, and then getting it into a cohesive unit, and then probably launching it on the Gen website once that's done. That's another project I am involved with that, you know, again, it might be a long slog. It depends because, you know, I have a lot of that information that I wrote, but I don't have a lot of the pictures and things we had with it. So we're still trying to find things like that. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and sharing your research with us. This has been a very entertaining and interesting presentation. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Like I say, I hope it draws some interest.
Yes. So I want to go ahead and let's see. I want to make sure to let everyone know that you can find more Northern Kentucky history throughout the week on our Facebook page, the Behringer-Crawford Museum's Facebook page, and our YouTube channel, BC Museum. Please like and subscribe. I've also added all of our past presentations, including this one, will be recorded and can be found at bcmuseum.org. And I want to thank all of our sponsors and our supporters, the staff, trustees, and members of BCM. Our next History Hour is going to be this week on Wednesday, June 15th with Kathy Colopy. She's going to be discussing workers on the Dinsmore farm in Boone County. So that's going to be a very interesting presentation. So everyone, please be sure to tune in for that. We also started our Music at BCM concerts last night. It was a lot of fun with Ramona Blaine and the company. So next week we have Ben Levin and the Heaters on Thursday playing the blues. So that's June 16th at 7 p.m. It's going to be lots of fun. You're not going to want to miss that. So Once again, thanks, Russ. And I guess that's a wrap for this presentation, but thank you again. And I hope everybody tunes in next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Russ.